The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So, good morning, everybody, and good afternoon for our colleagues who are in Southeast Asia. We're going to wait for just a couple of minutes for a few more people to sign in. So, if you bear with us, we'll start in 2 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. So good morning and good afternoon once again. We'll make a start now if that's okay with everybody. My name's Mel Slade and I lead the Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies programme here at the IEA. We're really pleased to see such interest from participants today. We hope to hold these webinars on a regular basis and to continue to build a community of practice within the Southeast Asia region on energy efficiency policy issues. So please keep an eye on your emails for upcoming webinars. I'd like to start by thanking both Peter Wooders and Sarah Pasquier for agreeing to speak at this, as part of this webinar on a topic they both know really well. And just very briefly, the reason we're here and we attach so much importance to this subject is that low prices, low electricity prices in particular, but fuel prices too, hold back the development of energy efficiency. And that means that citizens around the world can't get the benefits of lower energy prices, and manufacturers aren't motivated to produce more efficient equipment and provide more energy efficiency services because the business proposition doesn't work for them. So we want to try and work out ways that this cycle can be broken. And the concept of energy efficiency swaps offers an attractive way to do that. So the idea is that money saved from government subsidy payments in terms of fuel subsidies can be channeled into supporting targeted investment in energy efficiency to make sure that the people who really need support can gain that support. So that's why we're here and why we attach so much importance to the subject. I'm just going to hand over very briefly to Emily, who's going to talk about the logistics for a moment.
Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to briefly talk about the agenda for today, which is just a brief introduction by Mel Slade, followed by presentations by Peter Wooders and Sarah Pasquier, and then we'll allow for about 15 minutes of question and answers. So we very much encourage you to participate in the webinar and to post your comments and questions in the comment box. Now, I just wanted to show you the attendee interface. You should be seeing on your computer. There are two ways to connect to the audio of the webinar. One is through your computer's audio system. Alternatively, if you'd like to call in by phone, and this includes if you're having problems with the sound, you can click on the telephone in the audio pane, which will display the telephone number for your country. And just call the number, and by clicking on telephone, you'll avoid feedback between the phone and the computer. Also, please, as I mentioned, just please ask any questions you have during the presentation, and we'll aim to answer them towards the end. And also note that we're recording the webinar. We'll make the link available for those who want to see it on our website. And following the webinar, we'll receive a short survey. You'll receive a short survey estimated to last about 2 minutes. And some of you have done this before. And it's really important for us if you could fill that out, because that helps us plan our next webinar. And as Mel mentioned, we're really trying to encourage to grow these webinars and to develop a community of practice and a community of energy efficiency professionals in Southeast Asia. So now I'd like to hand over to Peter to start the webinar.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you very much, Mel. I'm delighted to be invited to participate in the webinar today on two topics that we at ISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, find of primary importance as we look to move our energy systems towards sustainability. So it's about subsidies and their reform, and then it's about how do we use that reform to generate more energy efficiency, and vice versa. How do we use energy efficiency to drive more subsidy reform? So incredibly important topic, and also delighted to be involved with the Southeast Asia region as well. We as an institute have done a lot of work in Indonesia and some of the other countries, and there's been so much progress over the last few years. It's just a very exciting region to work in, and we look forward to supporting more progress going forward. Very briefly on my organisation, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. It's a NGO based in Switzerland and in Canada, but we have staff and people working in many countries of the world. Our aim is to promote policies that support sustainable development, move the world to a more sustainable development path, and also to help governments to implement those policies. And often, of course, there are political issues, there are communications issues, there may be design issues, and we like to help out where we can there. And we found one of the issues we were looking at a long time ago, back in 2005, was that of energy subsidies, which in our view, almost all of them act against sustainable development rather than supporting it. So because of that, we set up our Global Subsidies Initiative. You'll see on your screen here one of the homepages from our website, isd.org/GSI. There's an awful lot of material there on how subsidies have been reformed around the world, some of the techniques that have been used, reports, infographics, all sorts of materials there that hopefully would be useful to practitioners in this area. So start off with, I'm going to talk firstly about subsidies, and then we'll move on to the links back to energy efficiency and how the two can be brought together. There are various definitions of energy subsidies. They're generally pretty similar. This one on the screen now is the IEA's one. It's where there is a deliberate policy action by government that specifically targets a sector, coal, oil, gas, electricity, and has one or more effect. It either reduces the cost of energy purchased, it reduces the cost of producing or delivering energy, or it increases revenues retained by energy suppliers. And as Mel pointed out right at the top of the webinar, consumer subsidies, so the first category here, reducing the cost of energy purchase to consumers, that's a distortion to the price of energy. It brings the cost of energy below what the cost of delivery is, and therefore leads to overconsumption of that product and holds back opportunities for more efficient alternatives. And just to give you an idea of how large fossil fuel subsidies are in global terms, at the moment, they're around 4 times the level of subsidies that are going in to support renewable energy. They're 4 times the level of the world's aid programs in development assistance from OECD countries. 6 times as high as the amount of capital needed for meeting climate finance objectives, and 22 times the size of current donor adaptation funds. So as countries want to move more into making their economies more resilient, more adapted to climate change, they need a certain amount of money. A lot more money is going into energy subsidies than is needed for that. So just to give you an idea there of, in economic terms, the opportunity cost. Subsidies cost a lot of money and they could go to other purposes. What sort of mechanisms do we see? The first of these, the discretionary one, is when governments basically set prices on an ad hoc basis by decision. So still in several countries in the world, governments will periodically say the new price for gasoline should be, the equivalent of 45 cents per litre or whatever, and then they will revise that a few months down the line or a year down the line, and basically not follow the market. And what we find with that system is that typically over time, that price gets a long way behind what the world market would show, and the government has to make up the difference. It might make it up in a direct payment to the utility or the supplier of that fuel or of that electricity, or in some other way. But at the end of the day, the government ends up paying. And then the other two mechanisms here, governments are often tempted to try and stabilize prices, particularly when they're going up. And we see that in many countries of the world, when global fuel prices go up, prices at the pump or prices to consumers in their households don't go up as fast. Governments want, with good reason, they want to try and reduce the volatility, reduce the size of the rises that households face with their energy products. So they step in and say, we won't put the prices up quite so much. But again, that ends up back on the government budget. And then the third one here, import or export price parity. There are all sorts of technical ways of calculating what prices could be in particular markets and particular countries. And some of these end up creating subsidies as well. So in terms of how large those subsidies are, for subsidies to consumers across the world, this is using IEA figures that have been in their World Energy Outlook for now almost 20 years, and so have built up quite a nice time series. They are in the order of hundreds of billions of dollars per year, so a lot of money. And this graph here shows that the highest level of subsidies over the last decade has been in 2012, 2013, and that's when global oil prices were at their highest as well. So they were relatively low. In 2009, you'll see on your graph here, around $65, and then they went down again 2015, 2016 to $50 a barrel and $40 a barrel. And subsidies follow that, because basically the consumer subsidies are governments holding back prices. So when the world prices are not so high, there's less of a difference to be made up. But this isn't the whole story. You'll see on the graph as well, just before I go into the whole story, the different fuels there. Oil is a very important part of subsidies, particularly on transport fuels. Electricity also is an issue that's getting much more attention at the moment. I think is very important. A lot of countries are struggling to hold electricity prices or to increase electricity prices and make them reflective of the cost of supplying that electricity, and that can end up in many instances with electricity utilities that don't have enough money to sometimes to supply electricity, but certainly to maintain their systems properly, to invest in upgrades to the grid and to invest in new generation technologies. So those electricity subsidies often have a very bad impact on the supplier of that electricity. And then we'll see there as well, there's some gas subsidies too. Coal, direct subsidies to coal tend to be lower, but I'm sure plenty of you on the webinar today will understand that coal is an important contributor to air quality problems in cities and in many parts of the world. Whether that's a subsidy or not is a matter of a lot of debate between economists, but clearly when we look at the issue of coal, we have to think about the health issues as well, and the price of coal should reflect the damage that comes from the air quality problems it brings. So we see that the prices have gone down again in 2015, 2016. They kicked back up a little bit in 2017, and the subsidies went up, I think, to around $320 billion in the IEA's estimate of world consumer subsidies. But there has been some progress as well. And this is a graph that my organisation put together based on reports from the IEA, some of our own work, other people's work as well. And in the period 2015-2016, something like 40 countries around the world made progress towards reducing their subsidies to fossil fuels. So this is happening. It's never easy to do, but there are plenty of examples of success and plenty of examples of countries effectively moving away from this system of government setting prices every now and then on an ad hoc basis and moving into one where those prices are set automatically with reference to the market. So we'll see again later on in the presentation as well that the big reduction in oil prices that we saw from the middle of 2014 gave some economies, including in Southeast Asian region, the opportunity to reform subsidies without much pain, because the difference at that point between what the market price should be and what the government set price would be was very small in many cases. So they could simply say, we're not going to subsidize anymore. The challenge then becomes, as we see now, as the prices of world prices start going up again, how can the government maintain maintain its position of not subsidizing fuel anymore, or will it revert back and start supporting prices again? But the main point from this graph is there's been a lot of progress and continues to be. The IEA work as well puts together a country estimates. I think it covers 40 main countries, mostly in developing and emerging economies, and shows how big their subsidies are. There's a graph here shows in the dark green that a lot of them are oil, and in the light green, a lot of the remainder is electricity. Those are the two biggest sources that are coming from that. And then in some countries, particularly the producers, natural gas can be quite an important component as well. So we've got Iran here, Russia, United Arab Emirates, Turkmenistan, as having significant gas subsidies too. And typically you'll see from this graph as well, it's generally the energy producing countries who have the highest subsidies. There is some debate from them. In some cases they say, look, our cost of production is lower than the world price. We supply our energy to our consumers at above our cost of production, so is that really a subsidy? There's a lot of debate about that. In our view, it very much is, because you don't have to supply your fuel at lower prices to your consumers. You could sell it to the world market for more money. But the more important, I think, the more important thing, particularly for energy efficiency, is where we've seen in countries that have kept their prices low for many, many years. So Iran is on here as an example. There are many others. Venezuela. They end up using so much fuel that it ends up being a huge problem. So if you have a subsidy in place for a long time, that ends up with serious overconsumption of the fuel. It ends up with inefficient industry, inefficient processes, and it becomes very difficult to get out of that situation when the prices come back up, both because it's hard to put the prices up, it's a lot of pain for consumers to make that change, but also because the energy efficiency equipment isn't in place in the economy. It's not in the factories, it's not in the homes, it's not in the commercial premises or the transport sectors. In terms of public budget, it can be very significant. The blue diamonds here show subsidies as a share of GDP for a range of countries, and it can be anything up to, in the case of Turkmenistan in this example, 14% in 2016, and many of the other countries there somewhere between 2 and 10%. So very significant parts of government budget, and often of a similar level to the amount of money that goes into key ministries such as education or health or other ones to do around social security. And also on this graph you'll see the sort of subsidy per capita, and it ranges down from just over $1,000 per capita in Kuwait, and to significant numbers in many other countries too. Some work that my institute, Global Subsidies Initiative, has done recently looking in India. Just to go into a bit more detail, we looked here at subsidies across the energy economy, so all the way from transmission and distribution to oil and gas production, and then going through down to consumer use of all those products, and also including the subsidies that go to renewable energy and that go to electric vehicles now. We worked with other groups in India, so ICF Consulting from India and the Overseas Development Institute in 2017, and then CEW got a major Indian NGO in 2018. We used a definition of subsidies based on the World Trade Organization. It's very commonly used. It has 4 mechanisms, and it has, if you use it, you end up with similar figures as you would from using the IA definition or any of the others. And what we've seen here, why I wanted to show this, is very significant shifts in where India was subsidizing in 2014 to where it was subsidizing in 2017. So the blue circles here show the magnitude of subsidies. The biggest one there is the subsidy that was going to oil and gas, particularly to supporting transport fuel prices, so keeping them below market prices, gasoline and diesel. In 2014, it's got Indian units here, so INR is Indian rupees, crore is 10 million of those, and 157,000 crore Indian rupees is around 20 billion US dollars. So there's 20 billion US dollars going into oil and gas subsidies in 2014, big reductions of that down into 2017. Both gasoline and diesel are now largely fixed to market with automatic pricing mechanisms that they've been maintained. On the other side, the subsidies to electricity have doubled and are getting obviously more significant. Subsidies to coal have remained roughly where they were 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, at about $2 billion a year. And then you'll see the last one there on the right-hand side, very significant increase in subsidies to renewable energy. Been a lot of installation of renewable energy in India over the past few years, a real success story from a sustainable development perspective, and a lot of going into solar and into wind. And that has resulted in renewable subsidies now being almost as big as those of coal, but still behind those to electricity more generally and to oil and gas. Now, one very, very important part, and I'm sure this is not news to everybody on the webinar, who gets these subsidies. This is from a study the IMF did in 2010, a working paper based on a lot of other work that they've done in previous years. And you'll see very, very similar graphs from all sorts of studies over the years and all sorts of institutes. We look at the left-hand side, LPG, so liquid petroleum gas, bottled gas. The lowest 20%, the poorest 20% of the population gain just 4% of the value of that subsidy, whereas the richest 20% get over 50% of it. So this illustrates the point that using fossil fuel subsidies as a welfare tool, i.e. to try and transfer wealth to poor parts of the population, is very, very inefficient. Some of the money does go to them, and of course, when you look to reform, you do want to make sure that they don't lose out. We've got to be aware that huge amounts of the money doesn't go where we want it. And the picture's even bigger on gasoline. Gasoline is very much a middle class and upper class fuel use, and here, from this example, the richest 20% are getting over 60% of the benefit of that subsidy. So if the policy aim is to support the poorest and the most vulnerable, it's not a good policy. It's not an efficient policy. And we'll see another example here from Latin America when we look at how much of the expenditure by quintile, so 20% parts of the population goes on domestic gas or on transport fuels. On domestic gas, it's a relatively stable position. Obviously, the rich use more than the poor in domestic gas, but it's a factor of 1.5 to 1, something like that. But when we look at transport fuels, by far the largest amount of expenditure on transport fuels is by the highest income quintile, so the people who are the 80 to 100% richest people in the country, and that dwarfs the rest. So if we're subsidizing that fuel, they are getting far more of the benefit than other groups in society and other groups of the population. And we can also link this into the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and we put together a couple of slides here showing some of the key SDGs and how subsidy reform could help meet them. So SDG 1 is there should be no poverty. We know already that fossil fuel subsidies disproportionately benefit those wealthier households. But if we could reform those subsidies and then have targeted social welfare programs, we can reduce poverty. So a very interesting development tool there. Number 3 is about good health and well-being. And as I mentioned earlier, the issue of air pollution in many of our cities now is incredibly important and an incredible source of concern. Lots of people are getting unhealthy, many unnecessary deaths, very sad situation. And a conservative estimate is there are 3 million premature deaths worldwide because of outdoor air pollution. There's extra, of course, from indoor air pollution. And if we removed subsidies or taxed fossil fuels such that they took account of the costs of the health damages they're causing, then work from the IMF shows that global air pollution could be cut by half. So simply by better fiscal policy, we could halve the amount of deaths and illness from outdoor air pollution. Some of the others on gender equality, when we look at the issue of, again, who benefits particularly and go down to a gender disaggregated level, women often do not benefit directly from fossil fuel subsidies. And again, if there are better social welfare programs and better targeted cash transfers, then we can make these gender positive policies. They have to be positively designed, that's what our research and work has shown, but there is that possibility. Number 7, SDG is about affordable and clean energy. As Mel mentioned right at the top of the webinar, subsidies hinder the uptake of low carbon technologies, be those in energy efficiency or be those in renewable energy. So what about the idea, again, as Mel mentioned, of swapping those subsidies, take some of the value of those and put them into supporting renewables energy efficiency directly. Number 12 is about responsible consumption and production. And we know that removing fossil fuels will reduce the removing subsidies will reduce the global demand for those fossil fuels and enable us to get to this target of decoupling economic growth, so trying to grow without growing the use of natural resources at the same time. And then finally, on climate action, that's been obviously a target for many groups, and there are significant emission reductions available. The various models show that if subsidies alone were taken out across the world, something like 5 to 10% of world greenhouse gas emissions would go because of increased energy efficiency and some fuel switching. That's incredibly significant. It's about a quarter of what we need to do in the NDCs as written down at the moment. So a very, very important policy. Next slide shows that a lot of experience has been gained in the reform of subsidies now, and I think we now know how to do this. It doesn't mean it's easy to do. There's a lot of politics, there's a lot of local issues, a lot of political economy issues. But in general, the way to do this is first to look at the various reform options, detail them out. Secondly, then to say, how would those reform measures have impacts and effects on specific groups and specific interests? And that's very, very important. We don't want to leave behind poor and vulnerable parts of the population, and we don't want to put particular sectors of the economy under unnecessary pressure. Then the third part is to understand what people would want instead. So because you can remove subsidies, you gain a lot of extra, in technical terms, fiscal space, but effectively extra public budget. That can be spent on development priorities. It could be on education, it could be on health, it could be on infrastructure or pensions or whatever a country decides, hopefully a bit of clean energy as well. And we need to understand what people would like instead, because people are often very worried, don't take our subsidies away because we're getting something. We need to be able to say to them, yes, you won't be getting that anymore, but you're going to get something instead, and in our view, that's a better thing. And then that last part is about the engagement and communications that is needed. It's not often a popular policy to increase prices, but if it's properly designed and if it has mitigation policies attached with it and investment in development and domestic issues, then it can be a much better policy. And if government is committed to that policy and is able to sell it properly and communicate it properly and engage properly, then it can be very successful. So let's move to a concrete example. This is the case of Mexico. It was a significant subsidizer. So in 2011, subsidies were almost 2% of its GDP. And then a very interesting estimate from the finance ministry saying that every peso, so every unit of Mexican currency that went to the poor parts of the population, nearly 20 went to the richest 20%. So that's how inequitable the use of subsidies was. Mexico's made a lot of progress on phasing out its gasoline, its diesel, its liquid petroleum gas, and has used basically a scheme of regular increases, and that has effectively now meant that those fuels are essentially at market levels. And it's tried to keep the increase in consumer prices gradual. I think that's one of the main learnings here is if it's possible to plan subsidy reform and do it gradually rather than immediately, that's preferable for all sorts of reasons. But one of the challenges we still have in Mexico and in many countries of the world is that electricity remains subsidized. In Mexico, that is particularly to residential and agricultural consumers, and there are it's quite a complicated tariff structure, all sorts of different tariffs, and of 8 electricity residential tariff groups, 7 of those receive subsidies. It's just the very highest users who don't pay subsidy. In fact, they pay more than the market rate, but there are very few consumers in that. I think it's between 5 and 10% of consumers are in that top group. So next couple of slides just show some impact analysis that was done by the IEA 2 or 3 years back in support of Mexico consideration of reforming their electricity subsidies. Down the rows are the types of tariff reform options. The first one was a big bang, is an immediate liberalization of all prices. That would immediately reduce subsidies by a huge amount. It would put the tariff up to everybody by a huge amount, except they would retain in Mexico a kind of lifeline tariff, a low volume tariff for the poorest, but the tariffs then for other consumers would go up significantly as well. And then there are, within the rest of these, this slide and the next one, various different schemes that could be put in a 2-part tariff, put that only to large consumers, have some changes. Mexico peak is in the hot weather. It's an air conditioning peak at residential level. So what about the summer month charges and changes? And then moving into simplifying those tariff groups, the DAC in the last 2 rows is this tariff that went just to the top population, top levels of consumers, the highest volume consumers. Could that be extended to more consumers? Was one option. And then the VDT is basically a step-based volume type tariff, and you'll see then that would have a lot of impacts as well on Mexico's consumers. Mexico continues to consider what it will be doing with its electricity tariffs. Obviously, it's got a new administration now since the end of last year, and very interesting, and what I'll show on the next slide is that they're very strongly linking electricity tariff reform with the need to make sure that consumer bills don't go up. So what they're saying is that if electricity prices go up, then demand in those, or consumption in those households should also go down at the same time. So can the government support Mexican consumers with energy efficiency products and with solar panels and other ways of generating some of their electricity as well? So on this slide here is a comparison of expenses here for televisions, for analog TV with a decoder as against digital TV. And just shown there that in billion pesos, the amount of annual expenses by households and the Mexican government together on the analog side was somewhere over 8 billion Mexican pesos. If everybody went digital, it's down to less than 3 billion pesos. The light beige color there shows the amount of money that the government is effectively paying as part of the electricity subsidy here. So if it can get in higher efficiency televisions in this case, it can reduce its subsidy by 2/3. So very, very significant. And what Mexico's done is it is providing 14 million televisions to low income households, and that they would recover that cost through avoided consumption and reduced subsidies. And they've done similar things with other products in Mexico as well, particularly on fridges and on some air conditioning and cooling units as well. And this idea of a swap here of them saying, well, we want to reduce our electricity subsidies in this case. We will use some of that money and either support or give better quality, better efficiency appliances to the population as a win-win is a very important consideration, and I think one that we, and I think the IEA as well, would like to see a lot more of. So subsidies can be switched to other forms of support is the message here. The total subsidies, when we bring in production subsidies as well, so those to exploring and producing coal, oil, gas, maybe around $425 billion a year in a typical year. Then we can swap some of those in terms of diesel and gasoline. Why not swap some of that into better public transport systems? We have kerosene subsidies still in many countries. How about swapping them into solar lighting? And then diesel fuel subsidies are still used in many parts of the world, and electricity ones for water pumping. What about moving that into solar pumping? So there are options here for some successful swaps. Quite a complicated slide here on Indonesia showing an economy level swap. In 2015, they took advantage of lower oil prices, and they had a subsidy in local units here, which was on the budget of going to be 211 trillion Indonesian rupiah per year, which is about 15 billion US dollars in 2015. They said, no, we're going to phase it out, our subsidy, because the prices are lower. And it's hard to read on the slide, but they put a lot of that money into extra ministry budgets, particularly those looking for boosting growth, reducing poverty. They put a good amount of money into state-owned enterprises with the idea of building up infrastructure, and then a lot went to regional transfers and villages. I'm sure a lot of you know more about Indonesian politics and priorities than I do, but it's been a big priority of the Jokowi administration to support development across the archipelago, so in some of the more remote regions, in some of the smaller islands, so a lot of money went into that as well. That immediately got international recognition, and you'll see there's some changes here from the credit agencies of how they considered Indonesia's financial position sort of before and after the subsidy schemes, and everything has moved here from stable to positive against the various grades. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see very strongly there this black line of energy subsidies going right down, and it being brought, that money going into education, into health, into social security expenditure budgets. So a real benefit here for social development. There's a link here you'll see throughout the slides, which of course will be shared with you all, into a report that my organisation did on this. There's various other reports linked into this in this presentation too. And obviously an immediate benefit to budget. If we look at the far end of the graph here, a halving of the amount of money that the government was putting into energy subsidies. From, in some years, more than 20% of its budget was going to subsidies, down to around 10 or 12%, and some of that, of course, is non-energy as well. So an immediate change here, a big success story in Indonesia. So what about some of the links between energy efficiency and fossil fuel subsidy reform? I think we've spoken about some of those already. First up, a very, very simple idea. If we do subsidy reform, then energy efficiency becomes more attractive. The prices of energy go up, so anything that's more efficient, anything that's lower carbon will be more competitive than it was before. But then on the other side, if energy efficiency is in place, energy efficiency schemes are in place, governments have more confidence to move ahead with subsidy reform policies, because they know that the sort of pain and the extra costs on their consumers, be those in industry or households or in commercial premises or transport, will be lower. So both of these things support each other, and doing the two policies together is then, of course, very, very attractive. Here's an example from some work we did for the Nordic Council of Ministers, so the Scandinavian countries, a few years back. We looked at 20 countries and we said, what would happen if we were to greenhouse gas emissions, in this case, if we took out subsidies to fossil fuels in 20 countries. And on average, we saw a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in those 20 countries from modelling of 11%. Then we said, what if we take some of that savings and put it into clean energy? So in this case, 10% in red went to renewable energy and 20% into energy efficiency. And then we see that our gains in greenhouse gas emissions are no longer 11%, they're right up to 18%. So we've got a real double dividend here. If subsidy reform creates extra money, if some of that extra money can also, subsidy reform reduces consumption anyway because prices are higher. But then if we can take some of the savings and invest it into clean energy, we can get even more savings from that. And this is a very attractive concept. If we look at practice, this is quite a dated slide, but it looks at some of the carbon pricing and carbon taxing schemes that were around or proposed a few years back. Some of them start to talk about putting money into energy efficiency, particularly the ones down the bottom here in Canada and in California. Often in some economies, they say, well, we're going to increase energy prices through carbon taxation, then let's put some of that money back into the affected sectors, particularly the heavy industrial sectors and the energy intensive sectors, by investing in better processes for them and better energy efficiency for them. And a very interesting concept, and one that tends to bring along that industry then with the change politically as well, because they can see that their interests are being looked after too. So there are some examples of this. We can see the same in energy taxation increases as well. We can see the same in subsidy reform. There are some examples of this, but there could be more. So what's the way forward? I mentioned this idea of mutual support between energy efficiency and fossil fuel subsidy reform. Really, this idea of a clean energy swap is one I'd like everyone on the webinar to sort of consider and think about and think if it's relevant to their economies and how it might be taken forward. So if we take fossil fuel subsidies, reform them to at least some extent, can some of that savings go into sustainable energy? Back to an example from the India case before, on the slides where I showed how big India's subsidies were in the energy sector was the coal subsidy. It was nearly 16,000 crore, which is about $2 billion US. If some of that money went into energy efficiency, into renewable energy, then we also get the benefits of key priorities for the Indonesian government as well. Air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions air pollution reductions, which is a huge concern in India at the moment. Greenhouse gas emissions would go down as well, and then more renewable energy, more energy efficiency as well. So where should those saved public funds from subsidies go? I think there's been quite a lot of attention in this in terms of renewables so far, sometimes about energy access, so small-scale renewables in remote locations, sometimes on-grid. We think there needs to be more attention and more thinking about swaps into energy efficiency. There's also then about smart grids, smart meters, improving the grid as well. I think it's very important for energy efficiency, very important for renewable energy implementation as well. And this idea of a fossil fuel subsidy swap may help generate the money that's needed for that. It's important to look as well at disadvantaged households. Whenever governments are considering these sort of reforms, they do and they should be considering as well what those impacts will be on the poorest and the most vulnerable in their societies. And solar lighting is important, electricity is important, clean cooking is important, particularly then for the indoor health impacts which disproportionately affect women and children as well. And then of course onto the penetration of renewables, and then even thinking about electric vehicles as well as another efficient source effectively, but also very, very good for moving against pollution. We've looked at the idea of a kerosene to solar swap in detail in Indonesia. This shows the amount of kerosene subsidies that have been in Indonesia, this is in India, have been in place in India over the past 5 financial years. Big decreases. India's moving to reduce its kerosene subsidies, partly by switching to LPG, but other policies as well. And since 2014-2015 financial year, 86,000 crore Indian rupees of subsidy savings have resulted. So that, by my quick mental arithmetic, is something like 11 or 12 billion US dollars. That could have financed a huge number of solar lanterns, and nearly 500 million of those, or a lot of electricity, 40 terawatt hours, huge amount of electricity from mini grids. So yes, is that to some extent a missed opportunity? There has been some swapping in India on an indirect basis, but has this been to some extent a missed opportunity? We're also working in Zambia at the moment. Zambia is a country that's very dependent on its mining industry. Mining generates an awful lot of the revenue of the country and of the tax take, but it also consumes more than 50% of electricity of the country. And because it's such an important industry, a lot of those, excuse me, a lot of those industries are able to negotiate good deals with governments that are below cost. So they end up getting subsidized electricity and have low incentive to become more efficient. And this is a problem for Zambia, which is looking to get its electricity sector and its utility properly financed and to build access and to build better quality and more reliable electricity for all consumers. A couple of swaps are possible there. There's still a lot of diesel generators on the system. Could they be produced? Could they be replaced with cheaper solar? And there are auctions around that at the moment. And then second one, what about reducing the access to subsidized electricity in this mining sector, and then using some of that saved money to prioritize, in effect here, mining energy efficiency for the good of all, a kind of win-win situation in our view. Quite a complicated slide here, I'm sorry about the size of the text, but it shows that if electricity subsidies were reformed in Zambia, firstly that helps the government budget and they can do more with that budget, but then it could also result in more and better targeted social spending. It can help with low-cost renewable generation, and then of course it can help with the whole energy efficiency story, both in the fact that the price has gone up, so people are more incentivized to use energy more conservatively anyway, but also we have this opportunity for a swap as well. And here, some of the ideas here on a case study that we've been working on with the Zambian government, so the Ministry of Energy there, and with a local NGO called CUTS, C-U-T-S. We're looking at business models for energy efficiency investment and how they might work. Does that have to come from the mining company? Could it be third party? Could the government be involved or not? Second part there is to think about increasing tariffs, but then what about if a company does invest in energy efficiency, could it then be rewarded for its investment in that in some way through the tax code or other possibilities? One of the ideas we have here, we think that a proposal that reduces both subsidies and increases energy efficiency should be very politically attractive and should be attractive to industry as well. So we're working there with the Zambian government to try and increase that buy-in, to make people aware of that opportunity and what it can do for them. And then the result we're obviously hoping for is that mining sector electricity consumption will fall, cost recovery will improve, and it's a win-win for everybody. So I've talked quite a lot today, and it's a topic I do like to talk about a lot. Really passionate about the need for subsidy reform and increasingly about this idea of swaps as well. So three key messages to take away. Firstly, that energy subsidies are a significant draw on public budgets. So they were in 2016 on the consumption side alone over $260 billion per year, with high levels of GDP, which represent a high level of GDP in several countries. That savings could be reinvested into any number of development priorities, of which clean energy is one, and then swaps into energy efficiency would, as we saw from the graph, the modelling graph, would also increase the positive impact of subsidy reform, so we can get more energy efficiency, we can get more greenhouse gas reduction, we can get more air pollution benefits. Subsidy reform is progressing around the world. This is not impossible. There are plenty of good examples. There's a focus perhaps more on the consumer side, which are larger, consumer subsidies and producer subsidies, but it's increasingly important, I think, as well to look at the producer side. Often the primary driver for subsidy reform is reducing public expenditure. It's not energy efficiency per se, it's not environmental benefits per se, but they are very, very important side benefits. And the concerns that governments typically have centre on the poor and the vulnerable. How can we make sure that their costs and their already limited access to what they need is not reduced further. And then governments are often very worried about industrial competitiveness in certain industries, particularly those that are trade exposed and are strategically important for them. And then the final point I'd like to make is that energy efficiency reduces the negative impacts of subsidy reform to particular consumers. The overall benefits of subsidy reform are very positive, but they can be negative to certain consumers. And on the other side, the subsidy reform supports energy efficiency. So back to this virtuous circle idea. And so far, we've only had a few examples of formally reallocating fiscal savings to energy efficiency, so energy efficiency swaps, and we'd like to see a lot more. And I look forward to discussing on the rest of this webinar and beyond that, and with the IEA too, how we may make this concept of energy efficiency swaps sort of more real and more implemented in more countries. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Peter. Sarah, would you like to make a few comments based on that presentation and your experience, please?
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon to our participants. And I'm a senior operations consultant at the World Bank. Previously, I was at the International Energy Agency in Melanie Slade's Energy Efficiency and Emerging Economies team. So it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you today about the role energy efficiency and conservation can play when phasing out energy subsidies. I very much appreciated Peter's presentation on the state of energy subsidies around the world, the negative impacts of energy subsidies, and his examples of how current policies can be swapped with other policies in order to better achieve social, welfare, climate, and financial objectives. On an analytical level, these swap systems make perfect sense, but as I've seen working closely with countries dealing with the negative impacts of energy subsidies, it can sometimes be very difficult to change business as usual. So right now I wanted to share with you some of my observations from the work that I'm doing in different countries around the world. So first of all, why do countries undertake energy subsidy reform? Peter picked up a bit on this. There are different motivations for governments to phase out energy subsidies, but often governments end up doing it because they absolutely have to. They have no other choice. In some countries, this is because of geopolitical reasons. Prices will no longer be subsidized by a foreign power. In other countries where I work, due to decreasing world energy prices, the countries can no longer afford to use export revenue to cross-subsidize domestic consumption. And still in others dependent on imports, the rising fuel import costs have huge unsustainable impacts on public budgets. But in many of the countries where I work, the energy system is falling apart due to years of underinvestment and lack of maintenance and repairs. Energy demand is increasing faster than supply due to development and low energy prices. In these countries, attracting investors is virtually impossible because prices are so low, they're below cost recovery and lead to negative returns. So what is the process for reforming energy subsidies, and how does energy efficiency fit in? My job and the job of my colleagues at the World Bank is to work directly with energy companies, the regulator, and the government, which is often the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Finance, on a strategy to phase out subsidies. And this strategy includes several elements: restructuring energy sector debt and spreading it out the repayment periods over time so the debt is less crippling. It also includes working with the regulator to design cost-reflective tariffs that are phased in, as Peter said, over a period of years. It also includes helping the government build support for reform across internal and external stakeholders, because often the Ministry of Finance and the industry ministries are on board for reform, but other parts of the government need to be convinced. And of course, the public needs to be convinced. And finally, we help countries to design social welfare programs to protect the most vulnerable. As Peter mentioned, energy subsidies benefit those who use the most energy in society, which means they benefit most the rich. for the most part, the rich, and all kinds of social protection measures exist to better provide financial support to those who need it. But these energy subsidy reform strategies are also increasingly including elements to improve energy efficiency. And I'm so glad that the International Energy Agency is highlighting this in the webinar today, because I think that this is really an opportunity to get attention to energy efficiency and to bring the energy efficiency benefits to the population. So countries undergoing energy subsidy reform often have a lot of untapped energy efficiency potential. Prices have been so low that there's been little financial incentive to undergo energy efficiency. But now, faced with higher prices, energy efficiency is a great tool to decrease energy consumption and thus offset the impact of rising prices. So how do we decide with governments which energy efficiency measures to take as part of subsidy reform? It really depends on the country. The energy efficiency measures we recommend are based on, first of all, assessments of the energy efficiency potential and the sectors impacted by the subsidy reform. For example, if we're working with countries to revise residential electricity tariffs, the investments and the energy conservation campaigns will target residential buildings, lighting, and equipment. If we're working on transport fuel reforms, measures will target transport energy efficiency, including measures to improve vehicle fuel economy, actions to shift people to more efficient modes of transportation, and policies to help people avoid travel. The energy efficiency measures we recommend are also based on public opinion surveys and focus group discussions that we conduct prior to implementing subsidy reform. We ask households, industry, and the public sector about how they use energy. We ask them which energy efficiency and conservation measures they are already taking and why. And if they're not taking them, why aren't they taking them? So once we identify all this potential and all the energy efficiency measures that can be most effectively put in place to lessen the impact of rising prices, we help governments through several ways, including by providing loans to decrease, for example, technical losses, to overhaul district heating systems, to improve building envelope efficiency. In other projects, we are lending money for LED street lighting replacements across an entire capital. In still other countries, we're improving the energy efficiency of public buildings, such as in schools and in hospitals. In countries phasing out fuel subsidies, transport fuel subsidies, we're providing technical assistance and loans for improving public transport systems, encouraging carpooling, and improving fleet efficiency. We also try to show the population how to conserve energy and how they can help mitigate the energy crisis and save money when tariffs increase. We place energy savings clips on TV, social media, and the radio. We also provide energy savings checklists for buildings and households. In one country where I'm working, for example, we noticed a huge amount of energy wasted in public buildings because no one was paying the energy bills. People would leave on the air conditioning, the lighting, and the equipment when they left for the day. And then in the evening, the country would experience many blackouts. There was just too much demand for the electricity supply. So we developed a huge energy savings campaign on radio, TV, and social media targeting public buildings. It was called Turn It Off at Work to Turn It On at Home. We borrowed from an Indian energy conservation campaign and used school children scolding their parents to make the link between how individual action could help lessen the impact of power shortages and the impact of increasing prices. So in conclusion, I would like to highlight the important role energy efficiency can play in mitigating the impact of price increases as a result of energy subsidy reform. As we know, energy efficiency is often not a priority for countries, and even less of a priority for countries with low energy prices. But subsidy reform processes are an excellent opportunity to gain support for and bring the many benefits of energy efficiency to the population. Thank you very much for your time, and if we have time for questions, I'm available.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and Peter as well. We have one question here, and maybe both of you could answer this. in your experience, what was the most successful example of an energy efficiency swap?
Okay, so sorry, I was on mute there. I think I highlighted in my presentation the Mexican situation and on the electricity sector. And there's been over about the last 10 or 12 years all sorts of schemes that the Mexican government has put in where it said, we will support you in putting in more efficient appliances into your homes because we also want to put up the electricity prices as well. And I think, firstly, those schemes have made sure that the efficiency measures are in place before the price rises are made, rather than the other way around. So you've obviously got huge credibility there. If people can already see that they've got a new refrigerator, they're going to be much more supportive rather than a promise of they might get one in the future. And I think the way that those schemes have worked as well, with revolving loans from the government, with reduced credit costs, has been really, really successful. So I think that, as an example of an effective swap at, if you like, at a sectoral level and an appliance level, has been really, really impressive. But then I think the other way of looking at it as well is this concept of swap can also be applied to an economy as a whole. And if we look at what's happened in India in particular, also in Indonesia, a country where we've worked a lot over the last few years, there's been this clean energy transition where there's been a move away from coal and into renewable energy and into energy efficiency. There hasn't been direct budget lines saying, we're no longer going to be putting these subsidies into this, and that money is going to be taken and deposited in another budget line of government, which is then going to invest in something else. But what has happened is, on an indirect basis, we've seen the subsidies and the support to coal and subsidies and support to coal go down, and the support that's gone into building up renewable energy and building up energy efficiency has gone up. So in fact, there's been a swap across the economy, and that has really resulted in quite a strong move towards a clean energy transition, particularly in India, from the country that we've studied the most and worked in the most there. So I think there are good examples of swaps, both at the small level, but also at the economy level as well.
Thanks, Peter. Sarah, do you have any comments?
Hi, thank you. Yes, I would just add that, yes, in the countries where I'm working, there's just not enough money. There's a lot of debt that's being taken on. So it's not, as Peter was saying, it's not about we're going to take the savings from here and we're going to put it towards energy efficiency. It's more we're going to use energy efficiency as a tool to decrease energy consumption or to decrease waste in order to help consumers. When we do talk about swaps, so we're going to use these savings from energy subsidy reform. We talk about it for things like health and education. So there was a big campaign in Egypt when they were undergoing energy subsidy reform that said the savings from this are going to go and put this many more million into public education and this many more million into improving hospitals. Because if you think about it from a public relations point of view, subsidy reform is very unpopular. So anything you can do to show people that they're going to benefit in ways they care about from subsidy reform is important. So talking about health and education resonates more with people than energy efficiency, unfortunately. So some of that's just about phrasing and marketing. And then on a policy level, you can think about energy efficiency as a great tool, but maybe not necessarily talk to the population about that's where the money is going to be shifted.
I think to build on that point as well that Sarah makes so well, I think it's very unrealistic to think that the entirety of a fuel subsidy saving would go back into the energy system in terms of clean energy, so energy efficiency, renewable energy. We know that there's often government debt and there's fiscal problems, so some of that is just going to be pure savings that doesn't increase the debt any further, and that there are other priorities around health or education or hospital beds or whatever it might be. But I think we can still make the case that some of that savings should go into clean energy. We might be thinking 10%, we might be thinking 20%. Of the order of those sort of levels of savings can go in. And one of the opportunities in many countries, there's big discussions about effectively improving infrastructure at the moment and making sure that countries become more modern, more able to bring benefits across their economies and across their geographies. And I think that's one opportunity for us here on the energy efficiency side, is to say, well, getting a much better energy system that's more efficient is a really good investment in the modernisation and the infrastructure that the country needs. But we have to be realistic and say that only a small portion of the savings will ever go into clean energy.
Thanks very much, Peter and Sarah. And we just have one more question that's come through. Do you have examples of how you identify the most vulnerable populations in a country so that you can keep the subsidy for those who need it? Generally, it's by energy consumption, but sometimes this is difficult to map. Do you have any comments on that?
Maybe Sarah, you'd like to start with a sort of World Bank experience on this one.
Sure. So we look at household income. In some countries, there's a very large portion of the population that doesn't pay taxes, so it's difficult. You have to include those as well. And then so we look at it depends on the country, but it depends on the government and the policies of the country. But in some countries, you'll take the 30% poorest in the country in terms of income and other indicators, and then use social protection measures to give direct grants or to increase other kinds of benefits that they were already getting. But if you want, I can circulate the methodology that's used in a lot of countries.
I'd add to that as well. I think in our experience as well, the household income expenditure surveys are very, very important, and they're typically carried out in countries every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years, every 5 years. And they allow a good data set to be put together to say, well, if we increased energy prices, how would that increase costs to different deciles and different quintiles of the population? And from that, there are generally in countries as well very good departments working on assessing where the poverty line is or where people are near poverty, and that can be fed into those people. Sometimes they're in government, sometimes they're within universities and institutes supporting the government. And from that work, what we typically find, I think Sarah's figure there was very good, that typically you might want to say for sort of basic support, you might need to support 20, 30, 40% of the population if you're going to increase energy prices significantly in some way. Then you get into how do you identify who they are. And in a country such as Indonesia, they've used direct benefit transfers, so they've used cash transfers when they put up energy prices at various times. It's impossible to target those perfectly, but I think what experience has typically shown that if you're aiming to support the poorest 30%, you might have to actually support 40% of people to make sure that nobody slips through the net. But you've still got a huge amount of savings from your fiscal scheme, so it doesn't matter if you, in that effect, slightly overcompensate. You might have to use then local ways of distributing wealth through village chiefs and through community leaders and through, in some cases, unions and other organized sources. And I think one of the key points here is that as long as there is some way of transferring welfare to those who need it, any policy is going to be better than the very, very inefficient fossil fuel subsidy way where you use energy pricing as a welfare scheme, because so little of it, as we saw, actually goes to those who need it. Any other policy, even if it's not perfect, even if it slightly overcompensates or isn't perfectly targeted, will be a lot more effective than it was. The real problem comes when there isn't a way of transferring welfare. So in some of the least developed countries, there just aren't good ways of transferring welfare to people who really need it, through cash, through ministries, through special projects, through whatever. And in that case, I think we've really got to think about whether it's appropriate to reform subsidies. I think the main message is, as long as there's a functioning welfare system, then subsidy reform is generally something that can work.
Thanks, Peter and Sarah. We'll just take one more question, if that's okay. So this one is, fuel subsidies is a political decision, usually in the hands of presidents. In this case, how do you make subsidy swaps work in developing countries? Like, how do you make the case, I guess the question is.
I think it's a good point, and saying that it is a decision that's typically made at the highest level. Sarah made the point earlier that often if we look at the ministries across the country, then Ministry of Finance will be very for subsidy reform. They want a budget to spend on other things, and they want also a budget that they know how big it's going to be. They don't want to be relying on where the oil price goes to see how big their expenditure's got to be on subsidies over the year. The Ministry of Environment is typically for subsidy reform. Ministry of Energy is often not for it, and has quite a lot of significant power in the country. And then you've got other ministries around social welfare and social policy and so on, who need to be reassured that this is going to work for them. I think what we see practically in terms of reform is that unless there is leadership and commitment at the highest levels of government, it's not going to happen. So this has to be something that is pushed ultimately by the President or the Prime Minister's office. There are windows of opportunity then that countries can use. Typically, after a new president is elected, the first 6 months after that are the perfect time to bring in policies, when they're still very popular and they've got a strong mandate and from the population. And then there is very, very significant savings that they could have. These can be very important policies. This is not, it is very easy to look at the negative side of subsidy reform, but the savings are so huge that the economy will benefit if you can do this. And if you can get past that political problem, then all can be done. It's about timing. When do you do it? Don't do it when inflation is high. Don't do it when the president is unpopular. Don't do it when the ministries are not coordinated. But the converse of that, it can be done. Communicate it well. Does need high-level buy-in, and put it out as a package. Include in that package what else people are going to get instead. Why this is a good policy for them. How it's going to support clean energy. How it's going to support health. How it's going to support education. So again, I take the point. I think high-level government support is required, but again, this has happened in many, many countries over the last 5-10 years, so it can be done, and I think there's increasingly knowledge of how to do it and do it well.
I'll just add one thing to what Peter said, which I thought was excellent. Oftentimes, as I mentioned, countries will find themselves in a situation where they absolutely have to do it. I'm thinking, for example, when they're having a financial crisis, they need to borrow money from international institutions, and it's just not possible for them to borrow money unless they address this huge issue of subsidy reform.
Okay, well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Peter, for this great webinar today. I hope everyone's really enjoyed it, and thank you all to the participants for joining. The webinar will be available after today, and I will also be sending around a short survey to get your feedback on the webinar and your ideas for future webinar topics. So please fill that in. But thank you again to Peter and Sarah, and thank you everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks all. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. Goodbye.